be like. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Paul, and it is the after lunch slot. So I wanted to get everyone with the age of rage in mind going the polar opposite and saying something to their next door neighbour that makes them happy. So please say something to your next door neighbour that makes you happy. Just 1 minute. Makes you happy.
So nice to see
Wine and JetBlue
Makes you
mints.
happy. Think about that
Wine and
concept.
JetBlue mints.
Mints.
Yes. Yeah. We just have it on a few airplanes.
I love
Fair
it.
enough. I gotta check that out.
Works.
But it's really good.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yeah. And that's why I was asking about the sectors, because like, how come this doesn't pop up only from Chicago?
Yeah.
Okay.
Happiness. The things you don't know.
We may ask at the end what your little mementos of happiness were, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm Rachel Cadillac. I am Flashman Hillard's leader of global corporate affairs and also run their Boston and New York office. I'm very delighted to have here today an illustrious panel, as Paul said. Michael Maslansky, who founded Maslansky and Partners, and we're going to hear about his research, which is The Age of Rage. We're going to hear from Kathy Baser, who is 4 times CCO and most recently Eli Lilly, from Doug McGraw, who is CCO of JetBlue and former FH. So we're very delighted to have you. And Chris Samuel, who is Chief Impact and Corporate Affairs Officer of Viridian Ecosystem, and also has worked in a number of different industries, including Monsanto. You can see the US soy reference there as well. So he's definitely going to be able to provide a global perspective. So the topic of fairness and rage, we all know intrinsically what fairness is and what it isn't. And ever since we were little children, we often were heard to be saying, it's not fair. It's not fair. And it was very much in the eye of the beholder. But Michael, just turning over to you, you say that it is a wake-up call, this research you've done is a wake-up call for corporate America, that negative narratives about the company are dominating global narratives. And there is a deep-seated unfairness that really pervades public sentiment. And this is creating an urgent need to shift the narrative. Can you tell us a little bit more about that research and what the findings really mean?
I'm happy to do that, Rachel. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I have a question first, which is, how many of you are familiar with the issue that McDonald's Corporation right now is dealing with over pennies? Anybody have a sense of what's going on? Is anybody familiar with the fact that the Trump administration has said that they're going to stop producing new pennies? Okay, so what's happening now is that there are people around the country, they're walking into McDonald's to get a meal. They're finding out that if the small number of people that pay cash, if it turns out that the amount of their meal ends on a 1 or a 2, then the price of their meal is being rounded down and they're getting the benefit of 1 or 2 cents. If it's a 3 or a 4, it's rounded up and they have to pay up to that next nickel or dime or whatever it is. And what's interesting is that people have gone bananas. Even if they're happy with McDonald's, there is a cohort of people, both in the stores and online, that are saying, how could McDonald's do this to me? I'm not sure it's legal. It could be theft. You are shortchanging me. You are taking my pennies away. Now, whether or not we care about the penny here or the penny there, I think that this is such a fascinating kind of illustration of what we are dealing with at a very large scale, where you can take something that really feels like it is pennies that we're talking about, and half the time, according to the policy, you're going to benefit. Half the time, it might cost you up to 2 cents. But people are going from being happy with their meal to incredibly pissed off at a profit-seeking and greedy corporation deciding to take away those 2 pennies. And what we're seeing is everywhere in the economy, we're seeing a version of this, often much more extreme, much more negative in terms of how people are feeling with it, where any time that a company takes an action where the question is, why are they doing this? People are drawing the negative inference. And they're saying not, there must be a good reason for this. They're saying, you are trying to take advantage of me, and this is fundamentally unfair. And so what we saw in this research as we started to look at attitudes towards companies across the country is that the dominant negative narrative about companies today has become about fairness. It used to be about caring, you don't care about me, you're putting your interests before mine. It has now shifted, I think, in line with a lot of the political conversation to be one that is much more about you are treating me unfairly. You are taking advantage of me. You are doing things that are not fair, not right. And I'll just give you some data on this. We now see that 78% of Americans say that CEOs and other executives get to play by a different set of rules by the rest of us. 71% say that the companies that they do business with, they expect that those companies will never, rarely, or only sometimes treat them fairly. And so they walk into their engagements with companies almost across the universe of different industries and kind of assume that there is an effort, a policy to go take advantage of you and treat you unfairly. And the thing about that is that fairness is one of those things that hits at a very kind of visceral level. It makes people take action, right? When you think you've been treated unfairly, you kind of want revenge. And actually there's a separate study, the customer rage study, that shows that over the last couple of years, the number of instances or the percentage of customers that say that they want revenge on a company for bad customer service has tripled. Because we don't like being treated unfairly. And so we see this kind of massive shift in how people view the companies that they deal with. And it's kind of translated into a second shift that we see that I think is really important, which is that, you know, if we think about the conversations that we've had in rooms like this about trust and corporate reputation and what it takes to build trust, it's often been, you know, we're in a moment where trust is kind of hard to build, it's easy to lose, but the focus on how we build trust is by showing the good things that we do. By talking about the positives, kind of, it can be societal, it can be how we operate, you know, well as an organization, that we deliver high quality products and services. From our perspective, that has changed. That we are now in a place where about 70% of the population also says that when they do business with companies, actually 63% of the population says that across 16 industries, when they do business with companies, that they expect those companies to never, rarely, or only sometimes do the right thing. So if we think about that, that means that most people in their interactions with most companies think that most of the time they're going to get screwed. And so we've gone from a place where when we think about trust and how to build it or how to maintain it, we have to move from thinking about how do we build trust from a platform where there's not that much friction if you're not in the midst of a scandal, to how do we anticipate all of those moments where the things that we do are going to be interpreted as evidence that we don't do the right thing, and so we need to combat mistrust all the time. And there's a third shift that we've also seen, and that if you kind of take those two and pile them on, the focus of the public has shifted in terms of what they want companies to do. You know, I think, again, in a lot of these rooms and a lot of conversations that we've all been involved in, the idea was, how do we show customers that we are good by doing good, by you know, addressing climate change, by being more inclusive, by solving big societal problems that only companies can solve because government's totally screwed. And now when you ask companies, would you rather do business with a company that treats you fairly, or do business with a company that can solve big challenges for society, 75% will say, just treat me fairly. Just do the right thing by me. And so when we talk about this age of rage, what we see is that, you know, for all of these reasons, people are really angry. And now about 40% of the population thinks that they can get revenge. It's actually acceptable to consider violence against executives who don't behave well. And we need to think differently about how we approach all of our interactions with customers, what we prioritize. In many ways, we've moved up kind of Maslow's hierarchies of needs as a company to kind of this search for significance where companies operate at this high level. We're going to solve big problems. And what we've forgotten is the day-to-day needs of customers who are in many ways really challenged today. And so when we talk about the fairness factor, talking about what are the steps that you can take as a company to really recognize this risk of being seen as unfair, and how can you shift that?
So, Doug, obviously the airline industry has a huge consumer base of many different demographics and persuasions. How has JetBlue experienced this trend? And is it impacting reputation at all?
Good afternoon, everybody. And Rachel, thanks for having me on the panel. I was wondering why you would want to have an airline on a panel about rage and fairness. And listening to Michael, I think I understand why. But it's a really great question, and it's a trend, obviously, that we see in our industry. I think kind of the current wave of this issue really started during COVID, and how airlines were refunding and taking care of customers as people stopped traveling. How we were trying to ramp up and down as the various COVID waves ebbed and flowed, and to the Biden administration, they definitely made a point of trying to push regulation and consumer protection that really resonated in the media, and I think resonated with a lot of travelers. So it's been 4 or 5 years of just kind of like a negative narrative on fairness in the airline industry. The other big factor in our industry is like the proliferation of really cheap travel and cheap tickets. And if you think about what Spirit Airlines offers versus what some of the more traditional carriers offer, you want to pay a cheap price, but you also don't get very much for it. And so that's created a different kind of sentiment around the airlines and what we offer. So, these are all tensions that we deal with at JetBlue every day. And a lot of our customers, anticipate that the airline is going to, take advantage of them. And one of the things about our brand is we were really started to bring humanity back to air travel. And, we have 5 core values that our founders created in 1999, 2000 that we still use today. But those words meant something a little bit different in 1999 and 2000. So there's this tension of how do we bring humanity back to air travel, in a world where the customer doesn't trust you or maybe feels like the airline industry is not on their side. And you see it at every point in the process of travel, whether it's when you're checking your bag or going through TSA, which isn't us, by the way, or boarding your flight.
Just for the record.
Just for the record. You see those tension points throughout the journey, and we really think about each one of those points and how do we address the tension that you raised.
Kathy, I'm going to address the pharma industry next. And I can see your shoulders go like this. But tell me about your experience with the pharma industry. The research says that it's about the middle of the pack in terms of the fairness factor, if you like. But the pharma industry is the worst at keeping its promises. What do you say to that?
Oh, I don't know about promises per se. I'm not sure I agree with that aspect of it, because pharma promises to help make sick people better, and they deliver on that promise. I think pharma itself, for years it's been at the bottom of the reputation. At one point it was below tobacco companies. I'm like, wait a minute, we cure cancer? They cause cancer? There was such a, but I think it goes back to some of the politicization of pharma. Pharma is, in healthcare, especially in this country, it is a remarkably complex sector. Nobody really gets it. Nobody understands who sets their prices, how does it work, how do you figure out what do you ultimately pay. It's based on so many factors. And it's also become a proxy for socialized medicine. So from a public policy perspective, it's easy to hate the big pharma. And notice the word big. Anytime you put big in front of a sector, it's become politicized. But it's a proxy for socialized medicine. And it's easy to hate the corporate people, but not your doctor or your nurse or your local pharmacist or something like that. So it's really easy. So you have that on the one hand that creates that. And then you had Pharma Bro, so Martin Shkreli, who increased an essential medicine by 5,000% or something like that. And then you had the pandemic. And everything about the pandemic, as we all know, was politicized. So it became a huge issue on top of that. And people fundamentally do believe that healthcare is a right. And so there is that tension that always gets played into it as well. So there's not one piece of this, but I do believe that whenever I hear an executive or anybody else saying, we just got to tell our story better. No, we got to do better, you know. And I think solving things is, and it's been said throughout this conference, you know, you can't fix a problem because of something you did by something you say. I think that's what Christine said, and it's nowhere more true than I think in pharma. So you've got to actually make some differences, and I'm happy to talk about some examples.
Yeah. Well, just shifting on to another sort of industry category, and that's the sort of sustainability industry. And Chris, you've obviously worked on that in many different guises that we talked about in your introduction. Sustainability, you know, is often associated with saving the world, and according to Michael, those very words may not be so effective in the current environment. Certainly, we know with you know, the anti-woke sentiment that there is a real sentiment against the framing of some sustainability initiatives. But for global companies who are often required to do good as part of their license to operate, how do they manage this sort of conflict between being fair in the US and doing good in other places?
It's a tough one. I think if we step back 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, it's still on trend based on who the current and future consumer is. Because as a consumer, you still want to solve for livelihood, access to food, water, healthcare, finance, housing, etc., and a little bit of fun, right? So I think it's important that we found success when you hone in on that core value for the brand and the consumer. I think if you look at the recent MIT study on sustainability, the data suggests that 73 to 75% of companies have continued their sustainability commitments and actions. 15% have reduced their commitments. 13% have increased their commitments. 40% have actually embedded sustainability commitments and actions into the business. So if we take a look 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and 5 years, 10 years from now, we are headed in the right direction. A couple of examples. I wore this because it was a particularly tricky opportunity when I was leading marketing and communications for US Soy on the export side. And US Soy on the export side represents farmers, represents everyone who exports and markets soy, Cargill, ADM, the CME, COFCO, the entire value chain. And the general narrative or perception is farmers in the United States don't like the word ESG or sustainability. It's a generalization. I know enough farmers who might not like that because they're in a bit of an echo chamber personally, but there's also farmers who do understand what they do on their land and how that can be monetized. So we were able to present a value creation opportunity. US soy, the data tells us, has the lowest carbon footprint versus soy of other origins: European, Brazilian, Argentinian, other plant-based proteins and edible oils. That's because farmers in the US farm a certain way. And we created a symbol in a label and said that could be marketed front and back of pack, and we put it on 1,000+ packs around the world in cultures where soy, plant-based soy, tofu, tempeh, natto are center of the plate, but also on fish and eggs and chicken and, you know, Goodyear shoes. And there's folks from MSL here who helped with that. You respect, hope you won't mind that. But it created shared value for the producer and the consumer. And there were tense moments. We created this forum called Soy Connects, everyone in the value chain together, and you had the odd US soy farmers still question the Chase Bank JP Morgan Chase economist on where's the trend going why are green bonds and companies and funds while they're making more money out of these commitments and actions, right? He's still questioning the value because that's his internal tussles. And I think as brand custodians, we have to lead the way in pointing to those shared values, creating those shared spaces, experiences. The other example I'll say very quickly is Marriott. I read this. The CEO met with his leadership team talking about DEI earlier this year. They were going to take a week to look at the research to determine what to do going forward. The next morning, he was in LA at an industry conference and got asked the question. And he said, the winds blow, the words may change, but there is one fundamental truth. We are for everyone, everyone is welcome, and we create opportunities for all. So there's ways to do it. And I think there is some continuum. And so I'm optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, there are ways and ways, and we will get onto that discussion later. But Michael, I just wanted to say, you've heard sort of 3 different industries. Did the research show that, in fact, the sense of unfairness was across all industry groups, across all demographic groups, across all political persuasions as well? Is it consistent?
Yeah, no, I think the short answer is there's a lot more consistency than there is inconsistency. This is a general feeling that regardless of what industry you're in, you should be concerned about the level of distrust, the desire to focus on fairness over goodness. But then there are differences. It's interesting that banks actually performed relatively well, really well. And part of that may be because they went through this crisis during the financial crisis, and they had to respond to set expectations and meet expectations in a way that it's actually pretty rare now that the bank that you go to do business with, that your money won't be there, or that the overcharge fees are mostly gone. They've dealt with a lot of the things that really pissed people off back then. So they do pretty well. Then we actually see some really interesting differences between industries. It was kind of surprising to see that big retailers perform among the worst. And when you dig into it, you see that it's actually among young, affluent people that they do the worst. And the other industries that do the worst with that cohort are the other kind of discretionary industries, entertainment streaming industry, airlines to a certain extent, where there is a sense, and I have this, and I will probably insult some people in the room, and I apologize, but who I call richilantes. They are the Mamdani voter right now, who are not the neediest population in a marketplace, but have the highest expectations about what they deserve from the market. And they are the angriest. They are the most likely to say that violence is appropriate against executives who behave unethically. They have the highest expectations of what those ethics should be. They are the angriest or the least trustful of the airlines, the entertainment streaming companies, because they probably want to spend in these areas and can't get as much for their money as they would like. And so they, I think, Doug, we were talking, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but like the kind of complaints that different companies get from people who say, the Wi-Fi should have been 200 megabits per second flying over the ocean, and it was only 50, and so you've got that difference. Interestingly, the older populations, Gen X and Boomers, are more likely to have negative perceptions, be mistrustful of things that they can't choose. Electricity, pharma, industries like that, where they are forced to purchase something because you need the drug to survive, but that changes your expectations as well. Interestingly, while there were political differences, Harris voters were in general much more mistrusting than Trump voters. The political differences are not nearly as significant as the age and affluence issues. So the younger, wealthier are the most mistrusting population of the overall population.
It's such an interesting thing, isn't it? That particular demographic is maybe the entitlement that you talked about. But Doug, from a JetBlue perspective, what sort of strategies or safeguards are you putting in place to deal with, these reputational potential issues But also, if an unfairness issue goes viral, and we have all seen those in the airline industry, how do you deal with that? And is it a case of hearing everything you've heard, reframing, or is it something you've been doing already? You think the airline industry has got a keen sense of where the fairness cross the line point is?
There's a lot there to talk about. And the first question, I'll just give an example, that maybe would resonate with people. But when you go to buy an airline ticket, you have many options, right? You have you can take basic economy, you can go all the way up to business or first class, and there's a lot of different rules. Is it refundable? Is it not refundable? Do you get a carry-on bag? There's a lot there, and so one of the things that we've tried to do is make sure that it's very clear what you're buying, and that if you buy a basic economy ticket, you have to click 100 boxes before you check out that you're accepting all the restrictions. And even when we do that, when someone has an emergency and they want to change the ticket and they bought a non-refundable, non-changeable ticket, they're mad at us and they email our CEO and say like, hey, here's my story and I want an exception. And so we have to really think through, like, in terms of fairness, is it fair for us to make an exception for them and change that ticket? Should we help them out? And how do we scale up and support 40 million customers a year with all their individual cases? And how can we also empower the frontline crew member to take care of them or not, depending on their judgment and understanding of what JetBlue's values are? So it's a really complicated thing when the customer doesn't really care what the rules are and then wants help or support at the end. And in terms of the viral moments, you've all seen the airline videos. If it happens on the New York City subway, nobody pays attention. They look away. But if it happens on an airplane, it'll be on all the morning shows, all the news sites. So there's just a lot of combustible energy in the tin can in the air. And so, a lot of it is really setting up a system within the company that when something does happen, whether it's on the plane or at the airport, and it gets recorded or someone posts about it on social media or they go to the media, that we can really quickly understand what the truth is. And if your flight attendant is on their crew rest somewhere, like, you've got to wait for their report. So there's a need for speed, but we also have to make sure that we've got the crew member side of the story, that we have their back because they're the ones dealing with a lot of these issues. And that we make it right if we found out that we did something wrong, and if we find out that the customer is manipulating the information in some way, we will defend the crew member. But you've got to work with all the operational teams and the airports to be able to get that input really quickly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It seems as though you have pretty good structure in place. I want to go to the pharma industry, and particularly the role of CEOs and leadership in terms of dealing with the issue of fairness. And obviously there was the terrible United CEO incident last year, and whether that was provoked by a sense of unfairness is interesting. But the natural tendency is silence. It was talked about earlier this morning. But in this context, what should CEOs do? How should they convey the fairness message? And I'm, interested in other panelists' views on this as well. What's the role of the CEO in this?
Well, first, that was an unimaginable tragedy.
Yeah.
I was in touch with their CCO that day, actually, and that was also the day of the DealBook Summit. So my CEO was headed to New York that day, so it became quite a, huge wake-up call, I think, for everyone, that we had reached a place. Not so much, nobody knows the intentions or whys, but it was the response. And I think that gets to your research, the people that were supportive of a murder. And when you think about that, we as a society, many people were saying, that's okay. And so I think in building on that idea of, where we are today and fairness and all of that, we have added that layer of politics to it that becomes divisive. So we're using industries, we're using companies to make our points, and we're building divisiveness. And I think we create a tinderbox, if you will. That's a very old-fashioned phrase. But it is that kind of idea that you're creating an environment that's ripe for that. So the role of the CEO, I don't think is changed. the CEO needs to lead, and he or she needs to lead by example, needs to lead with honesty and caring and all of those things. So, and we all know CEOs who don't do that. And they do that, I think, to the detriment of their organization's reputation and their ability to, attract and retain the best talent and all of that. But I think the CEO's responsibility is to keep in mind that it is actions. It is not something that we fix. I can recall having a conversation. Does anybody remember that there was a little faux Twitter handle for my company, my former company, back in the end of November? We had a spoof Twitter site. It was a beautiful thing. That was the day I also got COVID. And we knew within a few hours that this was happening. Happens a lot, actually. But this one said, we're excited to announce insulin is free. That started hitting, and we had to deal with that. And that got back to the fairness. And I think we navigated that well, I think, as a company overall. We were able to handle it. And that was also when Elon took over. So it was really fascinating trying to even find a rep over there to take that down. But we started thinking about what are we going to do to fix this? And the conversation, I was really happy to see how the conversation became we need to do a better job of telling our story, or the facts are there. Let's do a myth-fact campaign.
Always works.
Always. And but we moved pretty quickly from that to, wait a minute, we actually need to solve a problem here. We have lots of things to solve, but we're not going to solve it by just telling people, and especially our critics who already know the truth. It's just inconvenient. So they have their own narrative. So that's the other thing you're always fighting, especially in a highly regulated, highly combustible sort of reputation environment. So I think for the CEO, they have to be able to have the courage to take action and to be able to communicate that and to understand the simplicity of the actions too, and perhaps reach as many people as possible. So that you can solve that. Oh, please.
I think one of the things that we preach a lot in the work that we do is what my partner calls active empathy, and it's really kind of deeply understanding what is going on with the audience that you're trying to reach. And I think we can all look at not just what Luigi Mangione did as abhorrent, but the people who cheered him on as also abhorrent. And from my perspective, we should, but we should also take a step back and say, what would possess these people to feel this way? And what is it that we might be doing in the corporate world that may be making that a reality? And what can we do to change that perspective and kind of earn it back? And some of it we may say, look, there's only so far that we're willing to go. It's unreasonable to ask at a certain level. I mean, if you take the basic economy example, it's a really interesting, I guess, business question of if, on the one hand, it seems like JetBlue is doing all of the right things. You're basically saying, don't buy this ticket if you want to avoid additional fees, if you want a refund if something goes wrong, if you have any of those things, don't buy this ticket. Then you buy it, and it should be reasonable to say, okay, well, we did everything that we can do. But if we know that a certain percentage of people are always going to end up in a bad situation as a result of buying that ticket, and they are going to be extremely pissed off, and it may contribute to a ding on our reputation, then one of the other things, and I'm not suggesting that this is what JetBlue should do or anybody, but should we offer that ticket? Or are we taking an action that is helpful from a top-line perspective for the business, but actually is doing something that we know is going to have a harmful impact?
Okay, yes and.
Yeah.
Here's
Yes
the
and
deal.
no.
Because I don't think it's that
Right.
easy. I think it assumes that the organization, the corporation, is doing things wrong. What if the corporation, though, is not a victim, but is part of this bigger ecosystem of players who have different interests? And I think you've got to understand the context. And we talked about that yesterday at the conference, right? About context and understanding a crisis in its context. The person who did that faux Twitter site was not some independent person who might have had diabetes. This was a well thought out campaign by an activist who has differing points of view on the American healthcare system.
Right.
So understand that this is, again, you have to put it all in context, and you have to understand these are public policy questions. These are questions of, how does a system, an ecosystem actually run in an environment? So I think you have to, because if you just tell your CEO we're bad, believe me, that is a short conversation, okay?
And a short
we've got
career.
to, yeah, trust me. But you do have to sit back and say, okay, what else can we affect? What is the change that we can affect? Who can we align with? Who are the people that we can build coalitions with? How can we bridge some of these gaps? It's not just that we have to change our practices, but what can we as a company perhaps lead the charge in changing? And our response to that was very much an action with the insulin $35, pure and simple. It was a beautiful competitive move. It was a good public policy thing. We knew we were going to be, we'd been told, all of us had been, that we'd be in front of the Senate Help Committee. So all of these things, but being able to say, hey, we're doing what we can do. There are other parts of the system that need change. And to be able to come together and to have some of that dialogue, I think that's where we've got to work on solutions, and we've got to build coalitions and bring all pieces of this. You can't just point out the one and be responsive to everybody, because then you may be creating a situation that's not sustainable too. If you need to change all these parts of your business, you might not be able to operate. Your ticket might have to go way up in price, or the medicines might even have to change. So I think those are the things we always have to keep in mind as we look at these shifts.
Chris, context. How is it impacting how you're communicating or advising, how you communicate, particularly sustainability? It's all about context, you would say.
Yeah, I agree with what Kathy said, and building on that, just dovetailing to connecting the CEO piece as well. They're incredibly pragmatic people because they're chasing revenue and growth today. And they care about keeping people in jobs even while there's AI efficiency. It's not that every CEO wakes up and says, I want to lay these people off. It's a hard choice when you get to that stage. So I think that's something that we also have to embrace while we're in sometimes conscience keepers and very courageous with them in this fight. You asked a question, Rachel, that I think helps answer that is, how do people, right? Where does unfairness start?
Yeah.
Right? And in working with activists and NGOs and consumers and folks on both sides of the aisles in different countries, I think the first one is a difference in values and how those values inform the action in access, in pricing, in the sectors that I worked in. The second one, I think, is if I don't have control, I, the individual, right? So the first one is institutional. Second one is individual. I don't have agency. I don't have access. I don't have power to change my situation. And the third one, speaking of activists, I frame in the context of competition. Competition that is either commercial and therefore acting against your brand, or ideological and acting against your brand. I think that a few years ago, maybe 10, we had this concept of creating shared value. And it helped those, at least in the food industry, I think pharma did that too, in many cases around the world, to say, based on the impact and the cost to access, we're going to do IP and pricing like this in these emerging markets and like that in these developed markets. And this administration in the US is re-looking at things, but I think there's enough examples. As a brand, we took the lead to position on behalf of our customer and consumers to say, is it right or that a emerging markets farmer does not have access to the same innovation that all of us or North American, European, Australian farmers do? Whether it's inputs on seed or finance, affordable finance, that funds that better life and productivity, right? On pricing, we learned a lesson, a very good lesson. We were taking value-based pricing approaches and saying, if you used a bottle of pesticide to, take care of these pests, and it cost you, let's call it $50, and I replaced your need for this pesticide with an in-seed protein, it's kind of like a vaccine to a certain extent, I should be able to take 50% of the replacement cost, right? And then there was productivity gains and peace of mind because you don't have to wake up in the middle of the night worrying about if the pest attacked or whatever. So that was the pricing model. And we promoted and defended that pricing model. But at a certain point in India, I was leading public affairs at the time, we recognized we didn't factor poverty as much as we could have into the pricing. So did we meet the customer where they were? Did this innovation make India from the largest importer to the world's second largest producer and exporter of cotton? It did. It came out of America and it helped lift that country and millions of farmers out of poverty. But the pricing could have been a little lower, even though the formula and the principle was right. And we did that then. We took that learning into Indonesia and Vietnam. So I think that's a piece of, are you creating the access, and is leadership willing to listen and courageous enough to take those choices? And we were very fortunate we had that leadership.
So Chris, it's interesting because that is something that I think 5 years ago would have been widely considered a great move, and today is a very dangerous move.
Say more.
Because if you are a farmer in America and you need the pesticide or the different seed, and you are struggling to survive, there may not be as many small farmers as there were, but there are those, and you've never gotten a break in life. You know, you were in a tough area, you have a family farm, it's barely making it, and you're asked to pay full price, and the company that you're buying from, you find out that they have just done something to people a million miles away who you don't know. They're not American like you are American. They're not from the same place that the company is from, and they're now getting a better price. The reaction is, that's unfair. Why is this company putting other people's interests ahead of mine when I really need help with this just as much? And that is, it's a really difficult situation to navigate because the argument that you make makes sense, but if you're that farmer, then you feel excluded. If you're, and the same thing has happened with DEI broadly. If the program is designed to help a certain cohort of people, but other people really have struggled, come from a tough, are poor, never were given any advantage, regardless of what group they come from, and they see that they're not eligible, it sounds like you're excluding me, and that's unfair. And so there are all these places where there's a sense that like the programs, these kind of goodness programs in some ways, that were designed to help certain groups in certain places with the best of intentions are now perceived as you are excluding me or negatively impacting me by treating somebody else better than I'm getting treated.
Yeah.
Is that related to the outcome? Like there was such an uneven recovery after the Great Recession. Is there, because like people, mostly probably people in this room, ended up okay, right? We struggled for a little bit, but we ended up okay. Is it, but there's a whole swath, a whole cohort of people who haven't gotten back. Do you think that's part of some of that?
Definitely. When they feel like, I just want a fair shake. I don't want somebody else to get it. AT&T had a great campaign of everybody gets the same price. That's a fairness campaign. It's not new customers get a special discount.
Right.
But you can't do that for everything, can you? You can't change the business model in the way you're suggesting and have same prices in India as in the US.
Well, and I think that you can be agile with your pricing and you can be transparent with your pricing. It starts with, what are you committed to doing? Are you bringing your customer, employees, and other stakeholders along? We did that with data transparency. We've done that with seed. And when you get it right, you will be applauded. When you get it wrong, your farmers will be the first to tell you, and they won't stand with you. But I think that you have to be sure, you have to be very close to the customer. The other comment I think is leading with your brand values, focusing on the impact you want to have through the actions, whether that's on the product development to make access to nutritious food or a higher yielding seed, on pricing actions, on where do I access this? Is it only in this kind of store, or am I making it more widely accessible? And the third piece, I think, is in communications. And we've challenged ourselves, our teams, and everyone in this room to have that view of the forest. What do I need to understand commercially? What do I need to understand geopolitically, policy, regulatory, and then communications? Are my communications therefore on this inclusive or exclusive of the segments I need to keep in mind? So and then you have to continue to listen and adjust.
Talk about language, because in many ways, certainly from your research and recommendations, a lot of it is how you also calibrate the story to tell a story that is communicating fairness in a different way. So talk about language.
Yeah, well, I think, to Kathy's point, and I think Doug's as well, like you have to have the actions. We kind of assume that you are doing what you were talking about, but that there are many different ways to talk about the same thing. And every word you use is a choice about how you frame something, about how you articulate it. And the question is, how do you choose in a way that is going to get the outcome that you want? Our tagline is, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. So how do we make sure that you are heard the way that it's intended? And there is a way to flip a lot of the messages that have been around good to messages that are more around fair or more connected to business, which is another way of doing it. So if you think about I'll take DEI as an example, which it has often been communicated to describe the program that says we are going to focus on elevating underserved communities so that they are represented in the workforce at the level that they should be. That is a goodness message. It is felt to be very exclusive to people who are not included in it. The way to flip that is to say, we want to make sure that we get the best talent from wherever they are. And we know that in many places, or over time, we have not looked everywhere we can to find the best talent so that we can lift them up. And now nobody will have a negative reaction to what it is that you're doing, but really what it allows you to do is to do a lot of the same things that you were doing with that program to begin with, at least within limits, which is you're going to go to the HBCUs and have recruiting programs that you never had before. You're going to go to different geographies, different income areas, different places, different schools to go find people that didn't have the same, that didn't come from the same small universe of people. And so you may end up in the same place, but you haven't alienated anybody in the process. And so there are a lot of opportunities to say, where are we targeting a particular group in a way that is going to feel exclusive? And you may choose to do it, but there are risks that come along with it, versus where can we broaden this out to a value that is around fairness, that is more universal, but where we can still approach the same outcome. And I just have to your earlier point about you can't change your entire business model, to price the same way. I think, Albert Bourla kind of came to the conclusion that maybe you can, right? Yes. It upended the whole pharma pricing model.
Went way up.
Yeah, that was a fairness message.
Yeah. Doug, your mission is bringing humanity back to air travel. Is there a fairness component implicit in that? I'm curious, when you unpack that for yourself, when you make it come to life, do you really calibrate it with fairness in mind?
Yeah, and in fact, we've talked about different airline policies. As the market, there's a reason we have basic economy, and we can't take it away because we can't compete with Spirit, for example, when you go to Google Flights and you price. So there's reasons for all these things, but when we roll out a basic economy or when we change a policy that might feel consumer unfriendly, we always debate it at the senior level. We debate it and talk about it. And what does this mean at JetBlue? What does basic economy look like at JetBlue, an airline that's supposed to bring humanity back to air travel? By the way, if you buy basic economy and you're going to be in that middle seat in the back, you're going to board last, you're still going to have an amazing JetBlue experience. You're going to have all the things that we give, like free Wi-Fi and TV, and you're going to have a crew member who treats you just as friendly as they treat the person who's in Mint. So, there's just so much thought and debate at the senior. It has to start at the top, and we really have to make sure that the senior leadership team kind of knows what we're signing up for when we make different decisions around policies and how we enforce them, and what the consumer reaction to that will be. Because we're going to get, to the point earlier, we're going to get the complaints. And if the senior leadership team is sort of out of touch with what the front line is going to experience when we make a change, then we also have a really negative internal reaction as well.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on how?
I'll just add on this one. I mean, now in Veridian's ecosystems, we're a forest management company. We operate in the Western US and in Africa. And in Ethiopia, for example, we've taken a lot of the learnings in agriculture and said, these are smallholder farmers. And applying the create shared value model to say, if we are developers of a carbon credit that either removes or avoids carbon from the atmosphere, we recognize in today's market, a farmer who we're working with on either their crop or their trees is getting paid $2 to $3 per ton CO2 equivalent. Someone is then holding a carbon sink, a trading desk, that is then selling that to a luxury brand or a tech company at $18 and $20 the same ton, right? So when we're going in, starting with the seedlings, taking from the ag learnings, we're saying the community is going to own the seedlings. We're going to bring our forestry expertise. They're owning the IP. They're owning the seedlings. We'll help them in the service. And then we're running the ROI numbers to say, what is the impact we want to have? Knowing that ROI to that customer, knowing how the government in Ethiopia wants us to show up and be part of that emerging carbon forestry opportunity. And then how do we unlock that opportunity so that that tech company or luxury brand, CPG, whoever's buying that offset, can say, I did a better job in sharing value through that value chain. Now, certain energy companies and certain organizations who are running those trading sinks are going to be in the competition because we're going to try and drive more fair value. But I think there are a lot of companies that are trying to do the right thing. So it is a bit scary that so many people are feeling disenfranchised and there is rage. And I think all of us have to work quickly and courageously to say, what are we doing that needs to be told in some occasions, but also are there adjustments that need to be made in the organization, and then bringing stakeholders to those conversations so that we can deliver that value on our brand value.
So I want to end by thinking about future-proofing reputation. I would like each of you to think about what 2 or 3 principles you would suggest to this fantastic group here that they should take with them in terms of future-proofing reputation in the age of rage. Doug, do you want to go first?
I'll start. I have 2. Yes, exactly. I have 2. I mentioned a couple times our mission and values, and hopefully your companies have mission and values that you can turn to. In 2000, when we did our first flight, bringing humanity back to air travel meant a TV. It meant a leather seat. And it meant free snacks, basically. The bar was actually very low. But a lot of airlines now have TVs on their seat backs and give snacks. And so we have to constantly challenge ourselves about what that mission means today, what the consumer expects of us today, all the trends that we've talked about today. And that is a constant a debate that we have. And I think communications plays a big role in kind of leading that discussion and identifying the trends and issues that we need to try to apply here. And I think the second piece is the internal comms piece. It's the frontline employee piece. We really have to invest a lot of time and attention into every single individual in the organization because any one of them can ruin our reputation in just a second. And particularly in the airline industry, there's a lot of people out there working without a manager or supervisor kind of watching them. But what is watching them? People's video cameras, the very instantaneous communication that we have. And so, we spend a lot of time from the top of the organization with our CEO, like really setting the tone for what our culture is, what we expect of everybody, celebrating crew members who deliver excellent customer service and really do things that counter this narrative. And it's just, we just have to invest in the frontline people to, to be the ambassador in this really difficult time.
I think sorry, Kathy, please.
No, I was just saying, that was so smart. That was exactly right. That was great. No, I completely agree with that. I think we also, I would say yes, and as organizations, you have to stay humble. The minute you start believing your own press, or you think you've reached a point where you've gotten, your reputation is where it is, and you just keep on doing, is the minute things start going wrong. We all know that, but it's hard not to get caught up when your organization is doing so well. So I think you always have to stay humble, and you have to keep questioning every single decision, and it's the listening, right? At some point, I think, and we've all worked with companies or for companies who do a better job of telling their story than listening to the people they serve, whether it be their employees or others, so that their story continues to evolve and remain relevant. So I think all of that comes together. But the humbleness, in this day and age, I get back to that. How do we build bridges? You do that by coming in with a point of view that I don't have all the answers, and I need you. And I was so struck by the conversation with our Chicago leaders yesterday about listening. We say we listen, but do we hear? And I think that's something that we've got to help our organizations do a better thing. And hearing means that you are actually implementing what, change as a result.
My three are, first, connect the dots, commercial, policy, regulatory to culture, integrating all of the social listening, the investigative things that are happening on the dark web through, there's agencies in this room that provide that service, staying close with your stakeholder engagement team and the research. Michael's team back in the day helped us choose the right narrative to drive acceptance of gene editing that made those tools more accessible for entrepreneurs to work with. And it took from healthcare insights into environment and food, where typically you don't give license for innovation. So I think bringing those together, connecting the dots so you know what your consumers, customers, employees, the various stakeholders expect of you. So that's one, connect those dots. Number two is to be intentional, therefore, about what are the actions and how are you communicating. And the how of the communication, the two things I focus on are, what are we making people feel, and what's the timing of this? The timing of it in Viridian's context, we know that we can bring our sophisticated services to federal and state-owned forest land. We are not moving on that government affairs business opportunity for the next 9 months. There's a lot going on right now, federally and at a state level. So let that play. Let's continue to work with our private sector customers, our high net worth individual landowners, smallholder farmers in Ethiopia, Ghana, Burkina, now Indonesia, where we're starting to work. And we will get there. So intentionality around what we're making them feel and the timing of the action, whether marketing or communications. And the last one, I agree with, I second what Kathy said about humility and bolt on. As brand custodians, you have to have the courage and the candor with respect within your leadership team as well. And then with activists who might come after you on the day too, to say, well, here's where it starts and ends. So those three.
Michael, you get the last word.
Well, first, this is great hearing from you all on this. I'll add two. One is, I think there's something that we call moments of trust, which is that if you anticipate that people are going to look skeptically on some of the actions that you take or some of the communications that you make, how do you flip those into moments where you can surprise and delight and turn them into trust? And throughout, the customer journey or the touch points that you have in the different industries, there are often ways to flip those into moments of really valuable opportunity to build relationships. And the second one is, I'm a big advocate for inclusion, but I think I define it a bit more broadly than is often defined. And that is that as we look, and what this research highlighted, and we see in a lot of other research, there are a lot of people who are hurting out there. And they're hurting for a lot of different reasons, and we can't possibly appreciate all of the reasons that they feel like they are struggling. And just like when we were in kindergarten or when we were kids, the idea of if you got picked last on the team, you felt excluded. Every time we have a communication that targets one group to elevate them, no matter how kind of rational and justified that may be, there is a group that is on the outside feeling like they have been intentionally excluded. And what it does is it creates this negative backlash. And the more that we can use universal values and bring everybody to the table and still pursue our goals, I think the more that we can kind of tone down this age of rage and build trust again with customers.
Thank you. A great way to end the panel. Thank you so much to the panelists. And if you were feeling slightly depressed after that, think back to your happy moment that you talked about.
You did that intentionally.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.